Well, welcome everybody. My name's Bill Franks, and I'm currently running a consulting center at Kennesaw State University. And what I'm going to do today is take you through a really rapid fire in the time we have, some of the core themes from my book, Winning the Room, which was inspired actually by my move to the university from business in terms of recognizing how far people often are from where they need to be when it comes to presenting technical information, such as results of data science and analytics projects. So with that, let me go ahead and share my screen. You know, this book comes also from my experience. I spent many years in the consulting world, working with very large companies and having to present effectively, literally many times a week basis. And so what I found is that there are some tricks and tips you can do to be much more effective than the average person is as they present. And the key is when you go into a room, you want to help that audience understand what you found. They need to grasp the implications of what you found, and then you need to get them to take action. And if you don't complete all of those steps, and all you do is intrigue them temporarily, or they say they'll do something, but they don't, then you've actually failed. And so I'm going to take you through a number of tips and tricks. What you'll see is that the tips are numbered sequentially. I mean, I'm not in order, but obviously they're not sequential, meaning I can't cover all the tips in the book. I've picked a representative portion I thought would make sense in the session we have. So generally there's three phases. You've got to plan the presentation, and there's a couple sections in the book on that. Then you've got to develop it. That's literally creating the presentation, creating the content, and then you have to deliver it. And there's certain things you have to do at each of those steps if you want to make sure you're going to succeed. So one thing, this is about a live presentation to a live audience who typically is not going to be as technical as you are. So in a context of us here amongst data scientists, you might know how to build models, you might know how to write code. The people you're presenting to may or may not, and often won't, know at anywhere near the level that you know. And in fact, even your fellow data scientists, if you're huge in natural language processing, some of your peers might not know much about it at all. So even though they're, quote, technical, they won't get it. So that's the focus here. And I've kept all the visuals really simple. And there's two reasons. The first is it makes it easy for me to illustrate one specific point I'm trying to make. But like it or not, the vast majority of presentations today are still done using basic Excel and PowerPoint charts. So I think these are also realistic representations of what you would typically see and create most of the time in a corporate setting. So with that, let's talk about a few of the strategic fundamentals you have to understand as you get into developing a presentation, because if you don't have your core strategy and your core plan laid out properly, then it won't matter what you do from there. So the first tip is that results are not the biggest factor in success. And this is something that bothers people immensely when they first hear it. And it bothers me as well, because in a perfect world, all that should matter are my results. But what I'd like to claim is that at most 50% of your success will come from the results that you found. And at least 50% will come in how you present and package and position those results. Now, this is not to say having accurate results isn't critically important. It absolutely is. I'm simply saying that while you have to get to those results, you can't stop there. In fact, you're not even hardly halfway to success. You've got to then package it correctly, position it correctly, navigate the politics in order to get somebody to then accept what you found and take that action. So I always like to say from math proofs back in my school days, great results are necessary but not sufficient. So you've got to put a lot of time into your presentation. The higher the stakes, the more time you have to place. And the key is whenever you're in a live presentation, you are there to tell a story verbally, not to write it. And there's a big difference between what you would put in a paper or what you would put in a detailed email than what you would actually show on a screen. So as one example here a kind of slide I see all the time. People put way too much wording on it. They put it all up at one time. I can tell you now, even though I've told you in the audience that this is just an illustrative bad slide, you probably can't help but sit and start reading through all of the text on this, even though I'm telling you not to, because it's natural. I still read people's slides. The point is, this is entirely too much for people to absorb. And every minute that they spend reading this slide is another minute they're not listening to you, and they're not getting the context and the story that you want to tell. So you absolutely need to manage the flow of the information that you're providing to an audience. And you want to keep the slides as illustrative to support your point, not making the points for you. So in this case, if you notice, there's 4 actions at the top. You could distill this down for a live presentation to something very simple like this, where the 4 points are very clear to see. I can talk to each one because I can get all the points across I may have otherwise written. But even if someone wants to read this entire slide, they're through it in a second or two and they're back on me. In fact, even with this slide, I would probably use animations to have each of those 4 topics appear on the screen one at a time as I talk to them. But it's critically important that you keep the audience focused on you and what you're saying and not on your slides. The more they're looking at your slides, that's a bad thing. So if you laid out your strategy and you want to do a good presentation, there's a number of things you have to do in the planning if you're going to be sure that you're going to get it right. You've got to sit and think through, what is the story you want to tell? What order are you going to introduce the information? What level of depth are you going to go into? What are the actions you want the audience to take? All of these things have to be thought through. And the analogy I love to use is that, movie makers don't sit and just start shooting random scenes and assume they're going to get a good movie at the end. Rather, they sit and lay out a script and a plan for every scene in immense detail before they ever start shooting. Similarly, you can't just start throwing together slides and then assume that at the end you'll have a great presentation and story. What you actually have to do, much like a movie maker, is plan and design and lay out the presentation, figure out what you're doing strategically, and then you build the slides to fit that, much like a movie maker would. So one of the key things I see technical people do wrong all the time that you need to really fight against is telling too much. What do I mean by that? Because it doesn't sound like telling too much would be a common thing. You have to think about what the audience knows and what words would mean in their language. So let's say I'm in a car dealership and I ask the car dealer, hey, how does this backup camera work? The salesperson's probably way into cars and technology, and they get excited and they start going, oh my gosh, it's great. It's a 1080p LCD screen connected to an onboard GPU processor XYZ via an HDMI cable. It's gonna suck in video from a high def camera and then create these vectors that will display on the screen, et cetera, et cetera. 98% of people have no interest in hearing any of what that person just said. Because when I said, how does this work? What I probably really mean is, how do I use it? What I wanted to hear was, well, when you put your car in reverse, you'll see what's behind you. It'll actually show you lines based on how your wheels are pointed as to where you're going. If you hear a beep, you probably want to stop because something's in the way. This is what you have to think about. If you're presenting a classic response model, for example, and your business sponsor says, well, how does this response model work? They don't want to hear about minimizing error. They don't want to hear about a logistic regression curve or a decision tree and how they operate. What they want to hear is something along the lines of, well, what's great about this, it makes it very simple for you. We're going to be able to give every single customer a probability of response and sort them by that. And you tell us, how far down the probability you'd like to go, and we can go target those people. They're great to go with that. So you've got to think through, when they say, how does it work? What do they really mean? They almost always mean, how do I use it? So tied to this, your presentation itself should have very, very little detail. What you ought to have is a separate leave behind document. Now, for very important presentations, it's absolutely worth doing this extra effort, but it doesn't have to be really, really hard. One of my favorite things is to use the notes. For example, in PowerPoint, here's an example of what that looks like. Many of you are probably familiar with that notes area, but maybe you don't use it effectively. You can actually format the text in the notes. You can add a bunch of detail like I've done here. What this lets you do is it lets you add more context around whatever's on the slide. So when I print it as a leave behind, people will have it. It also forces me to keep things fairly short. I get to a couple of paragraphs, not to multiple pages. In a really extreme case, I could possibly have an additional page of notes on top of the slide, but you can't go too far. Another advantage of this is, not only then do people, when they're reviewing the material later, have the extra context, but as you're preparing to present, you have the notes there so you can refresh yourself with the key points before you go up on stage. So it's also a nice cheat sheet for you. And it's really easy to print this. If you're not familiar, it's just a notes page option within PowerPoint. And in fact, there's an entire notes template, just like people are used to a slide master. There's a notes master as well that you can set up. But I highly recommend just using that because it's a way to have two documents in one in a way that minimizes your effort. Another point is you need to show the fewest numbers necessary to make your point. So here's a common scenario. We have five products, 4 quarters, that's 20 numbers. Now we add column, row totals, and overall, I've got 29 numbers on this slide. Way too much for an audience to focus on. And in fact, based on my headline, you can go look at the organic honey row and probably figure out approximately, what I'm trying to say here. But I run the risk that the people who care about flavored honey are now busy looking at the blueberry and peach numbers while I'm trying to talk about the organic. The people who are worried about the regular honey business are all focused on that. The point is, I've got a lot of extra numbers that both cause confusion and distraction. This table can be great for a leave behind. It might be great in appendix. You don't want to show it live. What you want to do is break down into individual slides. Here's the row from that last slide, just the organic honey row. It's laid out in a way where it's impossible to miss my point. And as I go through that table, point by point, I might end up hitting every point on the table, but I'll do it in small pieces. And it won't matter that I show a bunch of slides because every time I'm showing a slide, I'm making a very specific point and it's very easy to see. And at the end, you might flash up that original thing and just say, hey, here, this full table's here for you to look at later if you'd like to see it in one place or it's in an appendix. We keep things as simple as possible. Now, you get into developing your wording in text. This is huge. You've got to make your wording in text, to the extent you do show any, very crisp, very succinct, and very easy to understand. So one of the biggest errors I see technical people make is to use the terms that we're familiar with and or that our software packages spit out. So here's a classic example. I run some kind of a model to predict response, and common metrics that'll come out of anything from R to Python to SAS, and you'll learn about in any of your academic courses: accuracy, sensitivity, specificity. I'll see someone put this table up on a slide. No one in the audience has any idea what any of these mean. So the person sits there, tries to explain it, and then as part of that explanation says something like, oh, that, sensitivity is like a true positive. Accuracy is like what percentage are correctly classified. And in the moment, those people will understand then potentially, although many still won't, what you're talking about. But when they get their leave behind later, they still won't know. So I always say, why don't you just put the plain English that everyone would understand from the get-go? No one cares about sensitivity and specificity. They do care about a true positive and a true negative rate. Even myself, as a trained analytics person, I can't keep straight which specificity and sensitivity are because they sound the same to me, but I absolutely keep track of true positive and true negative. So always think through, what words would my audience best understand? And it normally is not going to be the words that you and your peers use on a day-to-day basis. So another key area is your numbers and labels. So when we get into labeling things, you have to be cautious of how you do it because, again, a lot of our software packages these days put out 8 or 9 decimals of precision on every number they put out. A lot of them sit and put out things like scientific notation for some reason. You don't want to have that. You need to make it as easy as possible. So one example here, only show the precision required to make your point, and also a corollary, only show the precision that you're confident in. But if I put up a really simple chart like this, yummy outsold yucky 5-1, you can see that here. But do I really need $509 million down to the penny or 83% down to the thousandth to illustrate the point? No, it's distracting. Round it up, 509 million, 83%, boom, done. It's really obvious what the point is. People's brains aren't overloaded. Their attention is immediately right back on you, which, as we've talked about, is exactly where they need to go. So to get ready, you have to practice. This is one of the things. You have to practice your presentation multiple times. A lot of people come up and give a presentation. You can tell it's the first time they verbalize what they're going to say. I'll bet none of you would draft a paper and submit your first draft. I'll bet none of you draft slides and then go present the first slides. Yet somehow magically, a lot of people think they can go and present their first time. Literally go through it. practice it. I've spent a lot of time just walking around a hotel room by myself, going through my presentation, because as I do it, I realize where I'm stumbling. I realize where I'm not being clear. I realize where I need to possibly rearrange points, and I'm getting comfortable with my material. So you absolutely need to do that practice, and consider recording yourself as well. Focus on your time, not your slide counts. Everybody gets hung up on how many slides you have. This is really easy. If you have 30 minutes, hit 30 minutes. If you have an hour, hit an hour. Whether you have 2 slides or 200, who cares? If you're telling a good story and the slides are in context, everyone's going to be happy. You also want to make your critical numbers stand out. Here's just a simple table. Not too hard to follow, but what's most important on here? There's multiple ways you can highlight this. You can, have a circle animate on it. You can have an arrow come and point. You can like bold, italicize. There's a number of things you can do to just help pull out the specific things you want the audience to focus on. And you can do the same exact thing with text. Here's a number of bullet points. If I was going through these, I probably would have shown them one at a time. But the point is, you can use things like bolding and coloring and underlining, etc., to help draw the key things. So on that last line, potential lawsuit in red, that's going to get people's attention, as probably you would like it to. And so once you're all ready, you have to get ready to give your presentation. So here's one of the things I'll tell you for online you have to do most of all. You have to look right at the camera. It's really easy on these Zoom and Teams calls. You want to look at the people talking to you, but here's what happens. I'm going to just lean in real tight. Right now, your brain thinks I'm looking right at you, even though I'm looking at a camera. I'm looking right at you according to your brain. Now, if I just look down at the picture right below, notice how my eyes look down. I think I'm engaging with an audience member looking at their picture. You think I'm not. If I look at someone at the bottom, I'm completely looking down in a way it feels like I'm not engaged at all. You have to look directly and only at the camera, period. And this takes practice. If you're ever speaking on a Teams or a Zoom, always look at the camera and ignore the faces. If you're listening to someone else, you can look at their face. Another thing, stress the positive. People tend to get too hung up on caveating everything and being so thorough in their caveats. If I have, here's an example. Given unexpected data issues, we were unable to produce any results for the specialty products category. Kind of sounds negative, doesn't it? I would say the alternative truth that will get people excited is, hey, this is great. We have validated that we can move forward with this plan for every product except for our specialty products category. We're validating that right now. And by the time you're even ready to get there, we'll know the answer. It's far more positive. It's far more action oriented. You have to be honest. You have to be fair, but don't go out of your way to throw negativity into what's otherwise positive news. And tie your facts to impacts. Let's say you were asked to find out if a given treatment dropped complications in a medical scenario at all, and you're able to find 10%. That's great. No one's going to complain about that. But tie it to the other metrics that really matter, the drop in deaths, drop in hospitalization, and better yet, the drop in cost per patient, here illustrated to show it's minus 20%. That's the numbers that are going to get people to take big action. And the key is, if you don't connect those dots for them, you run the risk that either they don't connect those dots, even when it's a simple formula, they may not do it, or B, if it's not an easy connection, they may do it incorrectly. And either way, you could fail. So always lead your audience to the exact place they need to be. And if it's a hospital administrator, they're going to need to see the dollars. Take them there. And last, you're often asked to do one specific analysis, one tactical thing. Make sure you tie it to the bigger picture. Every company has higher strategies, higher goals. And so instead of just saying, hey, this campaign looks like it'll work next quarter and we'll hit our target for that campaign, well, let's go back to our organic honey company. Maybe our strategic 5-year goals include more organic business and more direct consumer interaction. If you're able to say, hey, not only is this campaign next quarter look like it's going to be a winner, but we're also hitting 2 of our 5 core tenets as a company for the next 3 years through this campaign, that's going to get people excited. Because specifically the executives who probably have to make the call, they want to get promoted, they want to get a raise. How are they going to do that? By not only hitting this quarter's numbers, but by hitting those strategic goals over time. And so with that, if there's any questions later, I apologize I had to blast through this, but here's my contact information. And I know it's time to run to another session. I'll flip off the sharing, and if there's some questions for a few minutes, I'll see if I can answer them. So let's see if there's any questions here. Just put them in the chat if you had anyone. Just looking. Don't see any. All right. Well, then I'll thank everybody for being here today, and have a great rest of the show.